Hello, YouTube. Sidekick here with another episode of Moving Mud, a history of iron bombing podcast. This is episode 18, The Air War Gets Rolling. We have arrived in the podcast at the point where we can start talking about the actual air war in Vietnam. As we did for Korea, I want to make this a discussion around why the things were the way they were. In other words, how doctrine, training, and aircraft and weapon design set the stage for how things played out in theater, and also how the experience of the war in the air changed doctrine, training, and design, both during the war and afterwards. And finally, I want to hopefully connect those things with what you can see and experience in simulations like Digital Combat Simulator. I think before we get into the details, though, it's important for me to explain the basic premise behind a lot of what I'm going to say about Vietnam. I think it's important because it really is the underlying theme for me, and also because it's not exactly the way things are described or portrayed in a lot of the sources you may come across. You may find this perspective controversial. I hope you don't find it offensive. Particularly, I hope that you don't find it offensive to your own or your loved ones' memories. So let me explain a little bit about where I'm coming from and why. Let's just say that if you've read much about the Vietnam War in general, and the air war in Vietnam in particular, you will know that the historiography currently basically presents the Vietnam War as a narrative of professionals led by amateurs. The basic narrative blames politicians for setting up the military for failure by asking them to do a job and then not allowing them the tools to do it properly. And this is definitely how it appeared on the ground. I do not dispute that. But I actually think the reality is a little bit different. The first thing that you have to appreciate is that the political level, the politicians in Washington, never wanted to win the war. They were not trying to beat the North Vietnamese. They were trying to get the North Vietnamese to stop supporting the war in South Vietnam. And in fact, they were actually pretty clear about those war aims right from the start when they talked to the senior military leadership. They were very clear when they asked the Air Forces, the Navy and the Air Force, what they wanted. They told them that was the job, to convince the North Vietnamese to stop supporting the war in the South. The job of the Air Forces was not to beat the North Vietnamese. So the military leadership knew that, and they accepted that assignment. And by the way, they assured the political leadership that it could be done. Their thinking was that they could prevail against the Vietnamese because they were convinced that their preparedness to confront a much more sophisticated enemy in total war, meaning the Soviet Union, that this experience would provide more than enough capacity to defeat a less sophisticated enemy in a limited war, which sounded good at the time, but it turned out to be pretty faulty logic. The assumption was that achieving limited war aims would require limited application of the same tactics, tools, and procedures that were required for total war. But, in fact, it required a completely different approach entirely. Then, having set faulty expectations, the military leadership asked planners and operational and tactical commanders to use faulty doctrine, inappropriate tools and tactics, and inadequate training to achieve the actual mission that they'd been given. To troops on the ground, by the way, this situation was pretty much indistinguishable from the aforementioned sending us to win a war but not allowing us to use the right tools. The problem was that because of the way those at the front saw their mission, when they didn't achieve success, they assumed that the right way to improve things was to stick to the same playbook but use less limited approaches than they were being restricted to. And so that's where the dysfunction happened. Because that was not the job the Air Force had been given, and not the rules that they had been given right from the outset, and by the way, not the rules that they had agreed to. The result was that instead of adapting their approach to the mission and situation they faced, the military collectively tried to adapt the mission to the approach they wanted to use, because they were deeply invested in that approach, because it was the one that they had equipped themselves for, and it was the one that they had trained themselves for. Unfortunately, neither their own politicians nor their adversaries cooperated with this desire. So the hole remained round, the military's peg stayed pretty square, and they just kept looking for a bigger hammer to hit it with. Now, this admittedly is a very high-level description. It will be incorrect of some of the details a lot of the time, but for me it captures both the reality of the decision environment and also the reasons why the results were and have been interpreted the way they have been. Please do not misunderstand. I am not trying to assign or shift blame. I'm trying to come up with a way of understanding why good, smart, talented, well-trained people got themselves and their airmen into the situation that they did and ended up with the result that they did that, let's face it, was not particularly satisfactory. So with that out of the way, let's start talking in a bit more detail about how the air war unfolded in Vietnam. I'm not going to go into any detail about the whole Vietnam conflict. It's just way too complicated for me to do it justice or even want to try. So let's summarize it this way. By about 1963 or so, it was clear that the forces of the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, or ARVN, were losing the war against the Viet Cong. The Vietnamese regime had little or no control outside of major urban areas. U.S. military advisors with frontline units were convinced that the ARVN forces did not have the training, or frankly, the motivation, to win tactical fights with the enemy. U.S. senior military advisors felt that the leadership of the ARVN was incompetent, probably corrupt, and incapable, and that if the U.S. really wanted to win battles with the Viet Cong, they needed U.S. troops to do the job. U.S. diplomatic and political advisors felt that the regime in Vietnam was incompetent and ineffective. And everyone agreed that the Viet Cong were being supplied and directed from Hanoi, and that further, the North Vietnamese regime was just a proxy for China and the Soviet Union, and that it was essential that the South Vietnamese regime be preserved at all cost as a bulwark against world communism. But it was clear to the U.S. administration and to U.S. politicians in general that their focus had to be preservation of freedom in South Vietnam and not the defeat of North Vietnam in open battle. And most important of all, while it was essential to block the spread of Chinese communism, it was absolutely essential not to make the mistake that had been made in Korea and provoke China into an armed conflict that might also bring in the USSR. Thus, taking any aggressive action against North Vietnam was absolutely off the table unless there was some definite provocation that the U.S. could point to in order to ensure that it was not seen as the aggressor. Starting in the summer of 1964, such provocation was provided, first by the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which was and is quite controversial, but which was followed by a series of incidents in which U.S. servicemen were killed in Viet Cong attacks. Ultimately, by the summer of 1965, the Johnson administration concluded that enough was enough, and they began the process of full military involvement in Vietnam, authorizing the transfer of 50,000 combat troops and directing the Air Force and Navy to begin a series of strikes in the southern part of North Vietnam in a campaign that would eventually become Operation Rolling Thunder. So that's a very brief summary of how we got to the summer of 1965. And with that for context, we can actually start talking about the conduct of the air war, or rather, the conduct of the air wars, because air operations in Vietnam really did amount to 2.5 different theaters of operations, and involved, well, at least 3 different air forces, the Air Force, the Navy, and the Marines. And unlike World War II, but more like Korea, the Marines really operated in one theater and the Navy operated in another. So let's pull it apart into its component pieces a little bit. The first theater, and the most famous, was the airspace over North Vietnam. This is the theater that tends to dominate the history and the narrative about the air war in Vietnam. The main players on the U.S. side were the U.S. Air Force squadrons based in Thailand, flying mostly F-105s, F-4s, and eventually F-111s. and the U.S. Navy operating a task force at Yankee Station in the Gulf of Tonkin on the coast of North Vietnam. The Navy's side of the load was carried by A-4s and F-8s, and then F-4s, A-6s, and eventually A-7s. So we'll come back to the details of this theater, but it really amounted to what would have been called a strategic bombing campaign in earlier conflicts, despite being performed by and large by aircraft that were considered tactical. And actually, it wasn't a single campaign. It was more like 3 or maybe even 4, referred to as Rolling Thunder 1, Rolling Thunder 2, and Linebacker, which also had 2 phases, but was a bit more of a single operation. Now, the second theater was South Vietnam. It's important to realize that this was a completely different air war than the war in the North, fought to a large extent by different forces than the North. It really needs to be discussed separately. The war in the South was very much about providing tactical support, in particular providing close air support, and often to troops in contact. It was fought by the Air Force, but mainly by squadrons based in South Vietnam, flying F-100s and A-1s rather than the F-105s and F-4s as in Thailand. It was also fought by the Marine Corps. In fact, it was pretty much the only theater in which Marine Corps aviators participated. Their experience was in a whole other category from the others, as in past conflicts, the entire focus of the Marine Corps aviators was supporting troops on the ground. They approached the problems in ways that the Navy and the Air Force never really did, but more on that in a later episode. The South featured a completely different threat and target environment than the North. There were no SAMs in the South, and actually very little large caliber AAA. On the other hand, the targets required extreme precision because they were often close to friendly troops. Dropping 4 tons of bombs from 5,000 feet was absolutely not an option here, but by the same token, flying above 8,000 or 10,000 feet granted almost complete immunity from any kind of threat. In some ways, it's pretty analogous to the threat and target environment in today's asymmetric conflicts like Iraq and Afghanistan, but without the precision-guided weapons, though, and that, of course, made all the difference. Now, the other theater, which kind of landed in between the other two, and which I think saw participation from pretty much everywhere, was the war outside of Vietnam itself, and this was basically the Battle of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Now, to be clear, the Ho Chi Minh Trail is not a trail. It's actually a complex network of routes through the mountains and jungles of Laos and Cambodia by which the North communicated and resupplied the South. Air combat here was a bit of a mixture between the North and the South. The threat environment was certainly more dangerous than the South. There was a lot more AAA, although still mostly lower caliber stuff, but enough to make low-level passes dangerous if it was present. On the other hand, there was no SAM threat, so high-altitude ingress and egress wasn't a problem. But also, on the other hand, the targets were extremely hard to identify or even see in a fast jet at altitude, so these targets were typically either vehicles themselves or infrastructure like bridges or supply depots along the route, but it was often underneath the jungle canopy. Either way, they were targets that typically required a certain amount of precision to engage effectively. So this combination of hard to find, hard to see, and hard to hit targets was not a good combination with the need to avoid low-level AAA, which, of course, is why the North Vietnamese operated that way. In the end, the problem was mostly solved by using airborne forward air controllers to run the engagements along the trail. These were pilots flying aircraft that would fly low looking for targets and also looking for AAA. Once targets were identified, they would call on whatever resources they could find, often some that had been dedicated to that role, but sometimes just any passing aircraft that happened to have the time, gas, and ordnance that could be of use. So aircraft from both South Vietnam and Thailand ended up striking targets along the trail, and they tended to be mostly Air Force, but Marine A-4s were also no stranger to the jungles of Laos and Cambodia. So, as you can see, there was in fact a lot going on and a lot we will want to unpack. And things are actually complicated by the fact that the command arrangements were, well, a complete mess. There really isn't any other way to describe it. I mean, in contrast to later conflicts like Iraq, which were well organized, there was no overall theater air boss. I mean, it was bad enough that the Air Force and the Navy basically only communicated through the Joint Chiefs of Staff, effectively. There was no one anywhere near Vietnam where there was a point of contact. And even within the Air Force, though, the organization in South Vietnam was part of a completely different command structure than the squadrons in Thailand. Literally, they belonged to different numbered air forces. And in fact, the forces in South Vietnam were subordinated not to another Air Force structure, but to the U.S. commander in Vietnam. But the forces in Thailand were not. So I'm really not kidding when I say that there were really as many as 3 different air wars going on simultaneously with, quite literally, no coordination or shared planning between them. And also, almost no sharing of lessons learned or intelligence, except at the tactical level whenever pilots of various different components interacted with one another. So, as I said, it gets complicated in a hurry, and so I think I'm not going to get started on any of the details in this episode. I realize that makes this episode a bit shorter than usual, but I wanted to get it out there to set the stage for what follows. And in the next episode, we'll start looking at the air war over North Vietnam. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you again soon.